1977, I moved to Papua New Guinea, once again because of my husband's job. He was appointed as a lecturer in church history at Wairongo Theological College in Papua New Guinea. And we lived in a theological college about an hour's drive out of Rabaul, which was a town of approximately 12,000 people. It was one of the more major towns in Papua New Guinea, and it was on an island called New Britain. It was 2 hours flying time from Port Moresby, the capital. Well, from Christchurch to Papua New Guinea was quite a cultural change. There were very few expatriates in the college. I suppose half the staff were expatriates, the rest of them were Papua New Guineans, and the principal was a Papua New Guinean. My husband was there to work himself out of a job, was ready to work to localise his job, so he was teaching there, and so ultimately a Papua New Guinean would take over his job. Within a few months of living at Wairongo, I was going long, that's the local word for slowly losing my mind in the bush, and with two young children, and I went to the local hospital and to see about working there. The local hospital was an hour's drive over a pretty horrendous road, and I still had two very small children. There was no money to pay me as a physiotherapist, but I was invited to work there as a volunteer, and I was very happy to work there as a volunteer because I was, as I was saying, going long in the bush, and I needed some stimulation of working. I was very fortunate when I went to the Nonga Base Hospital. It was a base hospital for the whole of the New Guinea Islands, so it took in a huge catchment area of the New Guinea Islands, which included New Britain, where I was living, New Ireland, Bougainville, and Manus Island, which are all, if you look on a map, are part of the New Guinea Islands. At the hospital, the surgeon was a New Zealander, the physician was a British doctor who of Indian descent, the gynecologist was French background, the medical superintendent was British. All of the senior positions in the hospital were all expatriates. There was a New Zealand physiotherapist in the physiotherapy department. I'll put that in quotation marks, a physiotherapy department. Her name was Julie Hamilton, and she was married to the surgeon. There was also an Australian physiotherapist there who is working as a volunteer under the Australian Volunteer Scheme, AVA. So those were the people working in the physiotherapy department. Julie was a very skilled physiotherapist in leprosy. She had trained with the leprosy mission and had done 6 months training at Karagiri in India. And her husband David was the surgeon, and he was also highly skilled in surgery for leprosy. Our first physio department, I'll put that in quotation marks, was a ward which would not resemble anything that we know in New Zealand. It had a concrete floor and corrugated iron ceiling and corrugated iron walls with a gap at the bottom of the wall and at the top of that wall, because of course there was no ventilation at all except from that. And we would have to do work on the floor, concrete floors, which was pretty hard on the old knees, and we had woven mats to put on the floor. That was our first physio department, but they built a new theatre block at Nonga Base Hospital, and the old theatre block was offered to us as a physio department, which was just heaven after this very, very hot ward. And in the theatre block we had fans in the ceiling, and the walls were made, the floor was terrazzo, so it was lovely and cool, and there were ceilings on the ceiling fans, which made it a lot easier. we had virtually no equipment, but there was a group of volunteer expatriate women who formed an organisation called the Nollonga Volunteers, because women, generally, if your husband was an expatriate, women weren't allowed to work. Jobs were only available for Papua New Guineans. But as there were no Papua New Guinean physiotherapists, I could work there and was very happy working there. For the first 18 months I worked as a volunteer, and the Noongar volunteers used to pay my petrol because it took me an hour to drive into Noongar Base Hospital and drive home again. Working with Julie Hamilton was a very learning experience because of her knowledge of leprosy. Of course, I had no knowledge of leprosy. Julie did all the leprosy treatment, and also she actually did all the giving out of the drugs and the likes as well, because she had been trained in leprosy, and her job was to work with locals so that they could take over the management of leprosy. So she worked with local Papua New Guinean nurses who could then manage the treatment of leprosy, certainly from a drug point of view. David, the surgeon, did quite a lot of corrective surgery for leprosy. Leprosy is a condition that attacks nerves, particularly the nerves that are very close to the surface. So the commonest areas of nerves affected was the radial nerve, as it came round the head of the radial, the head of the radius, and the median nerve and the ulnar nerve. Those were the commonest injuries. So if you had an ulnar nerve damaged, of course you got an ulnar nerve palsy, and you got that a typical claw hand. If you got the median nerve, you lost the use of the thumb, and if you had a radial nerve palsy, of course you had a drop wrist. Julie had some wonderful New Zealand contraptions which she had created. Her father was an engineer and had made this amazing machine where we could use number 8 wire to create the most fantastic cock-up splint. It was made in the shape of an S, and that was used as a cock-up splint. We would cover it, the number 8 wire, with IV tubing, and that made an excellent cock-up splint for leprosy. We made these quite amazing thumb splints for the thumb, because to lose the use of your thumb made the hand pretty well useless. But out of bicycle tyres, we would put these thumb splints on and then strap them round the wrist, not unlike a Royland thumb splint, and that made the thumb very functional in the hand. And but if there was a acute injury, acute flare-up of leprosy, they were put into plaster for 6 weeks and given steroids to rest the joint or the nerves until nerve function returned. Also, of course, on the leg, the commonest injury was a foot drop, and because as the lateral popliteal nerve came round the head of the fibula, that was the area most affected, which gave the patient not only a foot drop, but also made their foot quite a loss of sensation. And one of the things about leprosy is you see these sores on their hands and their feet. They're not due to sores from the leprosy, they're actually due to a loss of sensation where they got ulcers. Papua New Guineans don't wear shoes, but if you've got a loss of sensation in your foot, you walk on stones, you walk on things you shouldn't walk, on prickles. You've got these nasty ulcers on your feet, which needed extensive treatment for these nasty ulcers. And of course, infection was a huge problem too. So one of the things that Julie did in the leprosy clinic was the nurses would clean the wounds, and then she'd put them into those KD sandals, or those plastic sandals that were very popular in the 60s and early 70s, because the they couldn't be penetrated by sticks or stones, and all patients were given these shoes which protected their feet from injuries. We also gave patients mugs to use, because in the villages people used enamel mugs, which of course burnt their hands because they had no sensation in their hands, and so we would give them special mugs so that they could actually hold a mug without burning their hands. So many of the injuries in the hands, the ulcers in the hands, were due to burns. Of course, many of them smoked and have injuries from letting their cigarettes burn down too low and with their cigarette. If they had a lower limb recent nerve palsy, they were put into plaster to rest the leg, but they weren't allowed to weight bear. But trying to get patients not to weight bear was very, very difficult. And of course we didn't have an endless supply of crutches too, so we'd put on what was called a muskie stick. Muskie is a pidgin word that says you must not, and so we'd put these muskie sticks on the plasters, and it was really a long stick that was probably 12 to 15 inches long, and it would really prevented the patient from walking on their plaster cast. But one of the problems was in the hospital that it wasn't like our New Zealand hospital. There was nowhere where patients could wash. So we were close to the sea, and the patients would go down to the sea to go was long numbers. That meant washing. They'd wash themselves in the sea. These patients would go down to the sea with their muskie sticks and plaster, and of course washing in the sea was also dissolved the plaster. It was a never-ending problem for treatment of leprosy. Of course, I didn't have a hydrotherapy pool, but the sea was a wonderful hydrotherapy pool, and I would take the patients down to the sea, and that's where we did hydrotherapy. Being in the tropics, we were 2 degrees from the equator. It was lovely and warm. My main problem was that, not to get sunburnt, I always wore a t-shirt when I was going doing hydrotherapy in the sea. Another aspect about the hospital was that the patients all were in long wards, and the hospital didn't provide more than one meal a day, and the meal that they provided was just brown rice and tin fish and greens. So for a patient to do well, they had to actually be looked after by their family, or what they were called one-talks. Now, the one-talks lived under the bed in the hospital. So the patient got the hospital bed, which was those big old-fashioned cast iron beds that were about very high, and then the family lived under the bed. So if the man was the patient in the bed, the wife would be sleeping on a mat, a woven mat under the bed on a concrete floor, and she would have maybe 1 or 2 children with her, because if there was a baby at the baby at the breast always had to come with mum, because all babies were breastfed, and there might be a toddler as well. But those families actually were very important from a physiotherapy point of view, because we were very thinly spread as physiotherapists, and they actually did the physiotherapy treatment. So, for example, spinal injuries. There were always some spinal injuries, and the commonest spinal injury was falling out of a coconut tree and fractured lumbar spine and paraplegics from then. Or the other common injury was diving into shallow water and a cervical fracture. All treatment for spinal injuries was done in a striker frame, so they were sandwiched in between. They were turned every 4 hours from onto their face, onto their back, onto their face, onto their back. And when they were on their backs and the fracture was stable, then I would do passive movements, but I would teach the one-talks how to do the passive movements, and they were very, very good and kept those patients quite, keep the limbs from getting stiff. If you had a cervical fracture though, the chances of surviving were pretty slim. You might survive your hospital treatment, but when you went back to the village, we had no wheelchairs, of course, and you very quickly developed bed sores and septicemia from infected bed sores, or you quickly developed problems with your bladder. Catheterization wasn't an option, and those patients did not survive very well. While there, I would go on village patrols to visit some of these patients. I would go out with a local driver. Although I spoke Pidgin, I didn't speak the local language, Kunua, and my local driver, would take me out to see these patients in the villages. Occasionally I would get wheelchairs sent up from New Zealand. We had an arrangement where old wheelchairs that weren't in use would be sent up from New Zealand, but they did not last very well because of they rusted and we didn't have much in spare parts. But we became very good at wheelchair maintenance, pirating bits off old wheelchairs and repairing wheelchairs. I recall also I had a lot to do with repairing of amputations. One patient I had who had an amputation, I presume it was a crush injury. I lived an hour's drive away from the hospital, and when I was driving into the hospital each day, I drove through many villages. Now this particular man flagged me down one day with his artificial leg, and he said, he needed to go to the hospital, so I said, jump in. And he told me in Pidgin that he knew who I was, that I was from Rurongo, and he saw me go past through the village every day going to the hospital. And so he said his leg was damaged, and he had some crutches, and could I take him in and get it repaired? So I took him in, and we learnt to repair artificial limbs. Nobody had fancy artificial limbs as we know. They were just peg legs, but worked very well for these patients. And so periodically in my 5 years working in Papua New Guinea, this man, I would pick him up on my way into the hospital whenever his leg needed repairing. On occasions we have to send his leg away to Leh, which was about an hour and a half flying time away, because they had an artificial limb, department, put that in quotation marks, where limbs could be repaired.